Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you're having a great week. I hope you're finding a way to cool down or just embrace some of the sunshine that we're getting. It is summer, and it is good to have sun. I know in a few months from now, I'll be clamoring for it, as will we all. But I also hope that you've taken some time to think about what I shared during the service or what you heard through our music, through the prayers that were offered. And in particular, the reflection that I gave that was inspired by Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. This particular section, I think, struck me because I had no idea that the disciples were engaged in a kind of justice-building activity in that moment of the passage that was remarkable. That would be remarkable actually for today. And they were doing this in the first century, where some of the considerations that you and I would bring to discussion were not even thought about at that time. And yet there was something about justice that demanded balance. And so just as a recap, you'll recall that widows who were a part of what were called the Hellenist community. I mentioned a little bit about the Hebrews and the Hellenists. The Hebrews were Aramaic Jewish Christians, or Aramaic speaking, Jewish Christians. The Hellenists were Greek-speaking Jewish Christians. So they were, you could say, Jewish Christians, or in the case of the Greek-speaking ones, some were perhaps not Jewish in origin. But even if they were Jewish, they were decidedly different in terms of their cultural practices and observances, and it was creating tension in the early church. And so the disciples are, you might say, caught between a rock and a hard place. They have clearly been a part of a process that allowed people to get food and resources that were much needed, but there's been a major oversight. And this oversight has translated into a form of injustice where widows are not being cared for in the way that they deserve to be, but also the way that the church said that it was committed to. And so when the complaints are brought before the disciples, in Acts chapter 6, the disciples take a minute to listen and hear those complaints, and they accept the validity, and they act with justice in a direction of equity, something that we are still struggling to do. They appoint 7 representatives, all from the Greek-speaking community, to be essentially advocates and liaisons to oversee the distribution of goods and resources. Because distribution was a major ministry of the early church. People would pool their resources and share them in such a way that people had enough. Now that is remarkable in itself, but the fact that they were trying to establish a balance where clearly there was an imbalance, I think it's so remarkable because that's what equity efforts today are trying to do. They're trying to address historic injustice by establishing a balance that does not yet exist in our society. And you hear pushback now. I can imagine there was pushback then, but it was a major step in the biblical passage. It's known as affirmative action in the United States. I'm not sure of its counterpart in Canada, but we know as the church, there are always efforts to address historic wrongs. We not only ask for forgiveness, but we act out reconciliation with our siblings. And you see that happening in this passage from Acts. So I was really moved by it. And I hope it inspired you like it did me. That when somebody sort of comes at you and says, oh, now, or they, especially when they start quoting the Bible or they start referencing things, right? You can point to these sections within the text that are groundbreaking in terms of their impact and are still groundbreaking. This is not just something that's like, oh, for its time and place. 2,000 years later, it's still a pretty remarkable thing. And so I hope you are benefiting and are inspired by that reflection, because I know I was. Thanks for joining me today as we looked a little bit at Acts once more. Don't forget, join us next week. I'll also be here then. I'm not taking holidays. I might take holidays, but I'll be here on the Sunday. So I look forward to seeing you then, and hope you have a great week. Bye.